Um, Mostly because Ravi had me out really late last night, and I'm having a hard time standing. Thanks, Ravi. I'm going to sit here and kind of just slow it down a little bit this morning. And oh, God, we were out. Well, everyone was out at the great stadium the other last night, and some of us managed to crash our way onto the turf before getting thrown off. And that was very exciting, as much of it as I remember. So what I thought I would do today is not have video and not have PowerPoints. There's going to be plenty of that later today, and you had plenty of that yesterday. I thought I'd just have an intimate conversation with 1,000 people. And try and do that. I'll talk for maybe a half hour, maybe 20 minutes, and hopefully I could get you to actually engage in some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And there are a couple of microphones over here and a couple over there. Please don't be shy. I think it's really important for us to have a conversation as well as doing the sage on stage thing. So we'll try and do that. Before I begin, I wanted to ask how many people here are actually in business culture. Can you just sort of wave a little bit? Okay. Are there any economists here as well? Not too many economists. Are there any Twitchers here? Any bird watchers? Good. I'm an American Twitcher. I'm a bird watcher, and the first day I was here, a couple of days, I have no idea how many days I've been here. Thank you, Ravi. So I did a little bird watching while, sort of revving up and seeing Cape Town, which is a beautiful city, of course. And as bird watchers do, I went out to the sewage pond of, that's what we do. We go from city to city and we go to sewage ponds because that's where the birds are. They have beautiful birds here, especially at the sewage pond, flamingos, avocets, just gorgeous birds. And while I was there, I saw another bird there, and it was a black swan, It was my very first black swan that I've ever seen. There's a very famous book that came out last year called The Black Swan by a couple of economists who postulated that unexpected events are to be expected, and a black swan is a very unexpected event, and it has a huge impact in the way we live, in the way economies grow or don't grow. So this is a total shock to me to actually see a black swan. It actually looked quite like the Loch Ness Monster, little Nessie floating in the sewage pond. I have it on my iPhone, and I sent it to someone who also asked me what I'd been drinking the night before. So, at any rate, I take this as a very positive harbinger for South Africa. I mean, one of the black swan moments in Copenhagen was that very strange meeting that the delegates from South Africa were sitting with the delegates from China and Brazil and Russia, and President Obama sort of walks by and says, what's going on here? Can I join you? And at that moment, very late in the whole process, which had pretty much been a disaster until that point, some agreement was made on targeting certain emissions down the road to deal with global warming, and South Africa played a critical part there. So I think this black swan thing is very positive and very unusual, and I would take it as a harbinger of things to come, positive things to come for South Africa. So I thought I would just begin with a little personal journey as to how I got here and got into this very strange role of design guru, because I certainly didn't start there. I never went to a design school or fine arts school. And my only contribution to the whole discussion about design and creativity and innovation has been in the space between the space of connecting design to business and showing business over a decade and a half, the power of design, and the growing power of design to affect business, to create value, to the point where today I think it is the most important business competence you can have. And I'll get to that. So let me talk a little bit here, and then I'm going to get up and give maybe a 15 or 20-minute formal speech that I really tried to memorize, but I couldn't over the last 2 days. It was just impossible. So I'll read it. And then let's have some people talking back and forth about what design means for business, what business means for design, and what all this means for South Africa, okay? So very quickly, a brief biography. I'm one of those rare New Yorkers who was born in New York and lives there now. Most really smart New Yorkers go to California. But I grew up on 8th Street and Avenue D, which today I couldn't really afford to buy an apartment on that block. But when I was growing up, it was a slum. It was a pretty poor neighborhood. Most of the people on my block were jealous of the kids who lived in the projects across the way. These are government housing. So you could kind of tell, at least they were clean and there were trees and there was a baseball diamond. What we did every year in the springtime, we'd go in the backyard with bats and stickball bats, which were broomsticks, very thin broomsticks. We used to play stickball with them. And we'd clear it out by beating up all the rats that were there. And that was the beginning of our baseball season, was to go back in the yards and get rid of the rats. I went to public school. I went to the same public school that my parents went to. I went to the same public high school that my parents went to. It was a decrepit hole of a place. I think it was a decrepit hole of a place when my parents went there. And we called it a jail. And indeed, it had been a jail. There were jail cells still in the basement. And I remember as a freshman, our teachers made it a point to bring us down to the jail cells. And, if you're out of line, this is where you're. I don't remember anyone ever being locked up, but it scared the hell out of me, so I tried to be good, unsuccessfully. I went to public college, Brooklyn College, primarily because it had trees. I have this tree thing. Growing up in a tenement in New York City, you have a tree thing. This was early 60s. I was really young, certainly way too young to understand any of the education. So I remember nothing about college except wearing black. 4 years of nothing. I cannot remember a single class or professor. I do remember some girlfriends. So, but all I wanted to do, and all my friends wanted to do, was to get out of the neighborhood. And I did, finally. I succeeded. I joined the Peace Corps when I was 20. And I wanted to go to India. But apparently that was a favorite country at that time for Peace Corps people, and the quota was filled, so I wound up going to the Philippines, which was quite wonderful in the end. And I did a lot of teaching there. The best teaching I have ever done until I got to Parsons was teaching third grade science to kids there. And then I also spent a lot of time in Tondo, which is this, at that time and still is, an enormous slum on the outskirts of Manila. And before I went to the sewage ponds here in Cape Town, I also took a little trip out to the airport to see the townships here. And I was really surprised, actually quite shocked at the shanties, because it was exactly the same architecture that I saw in Tondo. The same sort of tin, the same space, the same architecture. I can't explain it. But I was very familiar with it, and it made me sad to see it. Where do they get the tin? it's not as if I wondered about that when I was in Tondo in Manila 30 years ago. I'm still wondering about that. It is a very interesting architecture, by the way. One of these days, I'd love to see sort of a Gehry-type building done by South Africans that incorporate the shanty architecture. Might be quite wonderful. Anyhow, okay. So I spent some time in the Philippines, a couple of years. I started doing journalism for the Far Eastern Economic Review, spent a few more years in Thailand and Laos during the war. Spent a lot of time on helicopters, so I wasn't afraid to go up and see the harbor. Then I came back, was almost drafted, wasn't drafted, almost went to Canada, didn't go to Canada. We had a lottery for the draft at that time, just lucked out, and wound up at the University of Michigan for what I call my 100 years of graduate school. It was never ending, went on forever. I didn't finish my thesis, which is called State Making and Political Violence in the Philippines. I majored in political anthropology, political science. I did meet the woman I'd spend the next 40 years with in the library. I was punished for not finishing my dissertation, so for the next decades, many decades, we were introduced as Dr. Beebe and Mr. Nussbaum. So if any of you are working towards your PhDs or whatever equivalent is, finish it because there are unintended consequences. So even my doorman in New York, it's Dr. Beebe and blah, 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 and Mr. Nussbaum. So never really planned to be into business journalism. I sort of fell back into it because I couldn't get a job at academia. And I started out covering international finance and international business at Business Week. And spent many years just moving up the ladder, doing more and more sophisticated stories. The dollar went off the gold standard, which was in the sort of mid-70s, and it was a big deal. We had the beginnings of globalization. I covered all of that. And somewhere along the line, I got very bored talking to bankers. Sorry. American bankers are very boring, I'm sure. South African bankers are not. And on a flight back from, I think it was Zurich, it was very dark. This is the apocryphal story of how I got into design. I was, I had my eyeglasses, it was dark. I had my eyeglasses off, it was dark, I was kind of sleeping. As I remember, I was on the aisle, and all of a sudden some water splashes into my face, kind of sort of comes down, and dribbles on my face, and I wake up and I immediately panic and think, oh my God, something is really wrong when that happens. And I'm fumbling to get my glasses on, get the light on, and I notice that in front of me, the same thing seems to be happening to people all the way down the aisle. People are jumping up, looking around, wiping water off or some liquid off their faces. And finally I get my glasses on, I'm peering down the aisle, and I see this figure going down the aisle, and it seemed weirdly small. And everywhere this figure passed somebody, that person jerked up. And then the figure turned around and started coming at me. And I was really terrified. I didn't know what to do. And people are bouncing up and down on both sides of the aisle. And then I could see that as the figure came close, it was a little girl who she must have been 3. And she had in her hand something I'd never seen before. It was a milk bottle with a hole in it, sort of a donut. And she was able, with her cute little hand, a little blonde girl, cute little hand, to hold one side of that bottle. If it had been a regular bottle, she never would have been able to do that. She had her hand on one side of the bottle with a little hole in it, and she was squirting all the adults on either side, and then occasionally she'd take a belt herself. And she had this gleeful look in her eye. And she passed me and smiled, squirted me again. And I looked into her face and I saw that she was completely empowered to torture adults and feed herself. It was nirvana. Nirvana for this girl. And it was only because someone had taken the thoughtful time to design a milk bottle, a little milk bottle, that she could hold. And I was really taken by that. So I went back, did some reporting, and wrote a very small 3-column story about the people who had designed that little milk bottle. And I got a tremendous response from the readers of Business Week all around the world. Again, much to my surprise, we had telexes at that time from people in Taiwan who wanted to knock it off as a product, and then people from all over the U.S. who wanted to buy it for their kids. And so that began while I was still writing about economic finance and policy and all the heavy stuff. And I joined the Council on Foreign Relations and all of that. I started my night job, which was to write about design. And I hooked up with the Industrial Design Society of America and got Business Week to actually sponsor their annual award. And this grew. We did an issue every year. And I sort of moved sideways into this role of explaining the power of design to create value in business. And at some point, we decided to move over as the web grew and became an important platform. Decided to move over from print to online. And I was really lucky enough to find a partner in Jesse Scanlon, who's in the audience right now. Jesse, you want to wave? Hi, Jesse. To set up an innovation and design channel, website, and open source it. We sort of walked the talk and brought in all kinds of partners and created, I think, one of the best innovation and design sites to this day. I started a blog a bunch of years ago, Nussbaum on Design. We started a magazine using the material that we created online and brought it into print, and it was called Inside Innovation and created a wonderful team of 4 or 5 people. That was probably, at that point I'd been at Business Week maybe 25 years, and those 3 or 4 years that we had this wonderful team, that was probably the best time of my life as a journalist in Business Week, doing stories about creativity, innovation, and design on all kinds of platforms. We had become the group at Business Week that was the first pioneer multi-platform team. And then we sort of progressed into visual media as well. So that's the story of how I got to where I am. No training in design. Actually, I didn't go to journalism school either. And truth be told, I still have 6 incompletes in my economics courses in grad school. Every time I would go into an economics course, and the professor would get up and say, "Imagine an equilibrium." My reaction was, well, up yours. Why should I imagine an equilibrium? Economics is much more real and affected real people in a real way. Why should I imagine an equilibrium? So I didn't, and I still have a lot of incompletes. So I'm going to stop now and go over here and read a little speech, which kind of captures where my thinking is today on design and the economy. And then very quickly open it up to questions, okay? Let me pull my pants up here. In the rush to pack, I forgot to pack a belt. So there's a student here from Parsons who's been waiting for my pants to fall down. So and he'll be up here right after me. I hope his pants fall down because he was there last night also drinking. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about. Okay, Michael. What I call designomics. It's a very interesting concept. I heard about it first in Asia, designomics. And I love this term because it conveys the meaning of design driving economics. And I like both sides of the term. To my mind, the global economy is emerging from the Great Recession, the worst recession since the Great Depression, with a very different shape, a very different trajectory, a very different set of growth engines. And design, capital D, is also emerging from the recent crisis with a very different form and function. I believe that a design-based business model and a design-based economy now provide the best new opportunities for creating economic value and growth and revenues and profits and jobs and wealth for the decades ahead. And why do I say this? Because I think we now live in a world of constant cascading change. Powerful geopolitical, demographic, technological, and economic forces are deeply disrupting life as we know it. They're eroding our traditional business, social, and political institutions. And old behaviors and methods of generating growth, I don't think are going to work nearly as well as they once did. And I think people are increasingly going to turn to design and creativity and innovation. And I use all these things interchangeably. I don't know about South African culture, but in the US, most male CEOs have a background in engineering. Many are from the military, and they're really uncomfortable with the word design. They think that's something their wives still do with drapes. And they like innovation because it sort of has a techie, military, manly sense to it. But the methodology, the tools, the thinking is really design thinking. So I just call it a banana, but when I say design, I mean design, creativity, whatever. So in this speech, I'm going to examine the major forces changing our lives today, show how design provides a package of tools and methodologies and perspectives that can generate new economic value. So let me first talk about some of the most powerful global forces at work that are transforming our lives. The first is the rise and fall of nations. A buddy of mine, Fareed Zakaria, calls it the rise of the rest and the fall of the West. It's the rise of BASIC, the rise of BRICS, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. I forget which one I left out. So one of the great forces of our time is the rise and fall of nations. The other great force of our time, perhaps a greater force changing our lives, is the rise and fall of generations. I'm ancient. I was born in 1947, leading edge of the boomer generation. That generation is now moving off center stage, kicking and screaming as it always has been. And it is slowly or quickly being replaced by a rising Gen Y generation. I think this is hugely, hugely important, as important, if not more important, than the rise and fall of nations. The third huge force that I think is affecting our lives today is technology, and by that I mean the spread of social media. And by the spread of social media, I mean the rise of new digital cultures that are joining real cultures in the real world. There are two other forces at work that I think are hugely important. If you invite me back next year, I'll talk about them. Urbanization. Last year was the first time the planet tilted. More people live in cities today than not. And of course, global warming. Secondly, I will then sort of examine the rise of design thinking and explain how it is the most appropriate means of generating economic growth today. I'm going to talk about how the tools and methods of design have evolved so that design has moved from being able to create artifacts to shaping interactions, from focusing on materiality to shaping social systems. And then I'll end the talk with a suggestion that, on a broad level, the organic, generative, culture-based model of design may be more appropriate than the mechanical engineering model of current business organizations. for the 21st century. So let's quickly move through the forces behind cascading change, sweeping global society. First, the relative, and I do mean relative, rise and fall of nations. Last month, I guess it's 2 months ago now, the internet regulator called ICON announced that it would allow web addresses to be written in non-Latin-based languages. In effect, it means the end of English dominance of the web. People in Asia and Africa will be able to address their email in their own languages. I see this as a move that'll go down in history as being as important as the dollar going off the gold standard in 1973, and in fact I see them as 2 data points on an historic arc representing a trend, which is the fall of the West and the rise of the rest. So what does this mean for the future? Well, you know, when you have 1 or 2 nations leading world society, the cultures of those nations tend to dominate much of world culture. Music, education, economic models, neoliberal economic models, art, political systems, we kind of know this. What we sometimes forget is that the homogeneity of world culture makes it easier in some ways for world commerce. You only have to worry about a handful of cultures that you do business in. Your own, the dominant one, and the others that copy the dominant one. But today, with the rise of BRICS and BASICs and other emergent countries, if you do business, you have to know many, many cultures. And we live in a growing diversity of cultures, a heterogeneity of independent societies. And if you want to do business globally, you have to understand all of these cultures. So we're moving from, when I was growing up, for about 20 years, a period of hegemony, of cultural homogeneity, to a period of diversity, multipolarity. Again, the rise and fall of nations. The second big trend is the rise and fall of generations. Even more important. Now, each millennial generation varies somewhat. I don't know what you call your Gen Y generation here in South Africa. Do you have a particular name for it? I can't hear you. It's the same. Okay, it's the same. That's why I couldn't. Okay, Gen Y. I'm not quite sure exactly what the values are entirely, the whole pattern of values. In the US, in Europe, Gen Y's value system, it's very urban, collaborative, participatory, it's very green, and it's very generative. Gen Y is a generation that likes to make things, not just consume them, but make things. Take things, remix things, rehash things, make things. In the US, it's also quite pan-ethnic, transgender, and in many ways transnational, very global. They think globally. There's a lot of research done on Gen Y in China. We share many of these traits, except that they are very nationalistic and pro-ethnic. Interesting. So Gen Y generation also in the US and Europe, perhaps here, live in a culture of free information that is instantly available. They live on digital platforms that are ever changing. They inhabit a participatory media that gives them tools to create, share, reappropriate content, including their own fluid identities. I believe millennials live in what I call a learn, make, share culture. And in the US, this generation is already beginning to change how businesses and society shop, retail, branding, communicating. It's really beginning to transform education, healthcare. We've got a guy here, Dr. Jay Parkinson, who's where are you, Jay? Over there. Go talk to Dr. Jay. He's leading a revolution in healthcare delivery based on social media platforms that have huge implications for well-being, for the delivery of all kinds of wellness services. And that's a Gen Y-led revolution. I think the rise of Gen Y is so important that at Parsons, I'm a professor at Parsons these days, we're launching a Gen Y research lab. And the mission is to do very deep ethnographic research on global, Gen Y, global millennials everywhere, and to begin to take some of that research and have the students themselves begin to create products and services, they already are, and to create an incubator that takes their work based off the research and stage them, present them to the world, to venture capitalists, to turn their insights and their products into real businesses. So it would be wonderful for you guys to participate and be wonderful for your sponsors to come over and help sponsor us in this Gen Y research lab. The third transforming force in our lives is digital social media. For the first time in history, I think it is now easy and inexpensive to create our own communities, our own cultures, anywhere, anytime. We can belong to cultures that we aren't born into, cultures that we choose to enter, and leave easily. Social media is creating tens of thousands of digital cultures every year. One of my favorites is Mommies with Twins in Brooklyn. Someone told me there's mommies with twins with blonde hair in Brooklyn. So now you need to do business not only in the 40,000 villages in India, you also have to do business in the 40,000 villages that are created every day online. So we have a new normal in the world. And I would argue that the new normal requires a new paradigm, a new economic business paradigm, and that leads me to design. Design has made a revolutionary journey over the last 15 years, and it has expanded and evolved from, again, focusing on artifact, on making beautiful things, on stuff, to being able to design social systems. And I think it gives us huge power today as designers and design thinkers to use that to begin to generate value both within business culture, but also within civic society. Design is far more important today, I think, to innovation than technology, which has become fairly available anywhere, anytime. So to me, innovation today is much more cultural and social than it is technological. And that's really what we emphasize a lot in Parsons. Co-creating, designing with people, not just for them, is really the key, in my mind, to creating economic value for corporations today. I'll do very quickly. The only prop I brought, aside from my little iPhone here, which I can't find. Here's my iPhone. Ta-da. Here's prop one. Prop two is my Kindle. I don't know if you guys have Kindle here yet. This is a new screen platform. It's an e-book reader, an electronic book reader. I got it for a birthday. It shows you my age. It's age appropriate. It's culture appropriate. This is only good for reading books. You can't create content on the Kindle, but you can download any book that you like. Until I got a Kindle, I would schlep, 4, 5, 6 books around the world with me. Now they're all here. The fact of the matter is, this is perfect for people in their 50s and 60s who are still in a book reading culture. My students hate it. It doesn't work for them because they are in the making of culture business. They like to get in there, use the tools, mostly on the Mac, to mix, remix, present, share, participate. And for them, this doesn't work. Actually, for them, the new Apple iPad doesn't work very much either because you can't create a whole lot. And they don't like it very much. So I want to leave a little bit of time for us to have some engagement here. I think what has happened is that the world economy has changed. I think business culture has changed. And along with that, at the same time, design has evolved into a very powerful economic tool, very powerful business model. And I think the two are sort of going on tracks, and they've really crossed. And 21st century economic value and I think social value increasingly will depend on design and design thinking. On just a final note, one of the reasons why I've always been attracted to design is that it's so optimistic. And we live in a very weird world today. It's very easy to get pessimistic. But But design has a future-facing perspective and a tool-using core competence that I just love. The whole purpose of design is to make the new. And that's a perfect message for all of us here at Design Indaba, to make the new. So let me end here and see if some of you would like to ask some questions and start a little bit of a conversation based on some of the things I said or some of the things that's on your mind. Please don't be shy. This is really not a time to be shy. This is a great opportunity to, someone said to provoke you, I'll make a comment about your new stadium. Who's the architect? Who designed that stadium?
Bruce, hi. Please will you just elaborate more about your comment on the Kindle? What are you saying particularly about the future of book writers and fictional and non-fictional book writers?
I'm actually very optimistic about, I've written a couple of books. I'm actually pretty pissed off at Google for, copying some of my books without asking me, but that's another issue. I think the form of the book is changing. And it's a very exciting prospect for book writers. You could still do long-form writing, straight print, and paint a world of graphic beauty with words. It's something I still like to do. And that's totally available, and I think at least for an older generation that loves books that way, those book writers will have 20 or 30 years of really good times ahead of them. But the book form itself is expanding to be more interactive. Books in the US have gotten shorter, have gotten punchier, have gotten, you can see them being remixed in terms of print. And I think now with the advent of tablets, we're going to see a much more interactive form of book. I think it's all about the narrative and the story and the presentation of information, and you can do that on any number of platforms. So I'm not too uptight about it. I kind of embrace it and look forward to it and hope my own skills as a writer will grow so that I can participate in it. Yeah. Some more questions? Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. If we brought you back here, could you explain to our President's Economic Council how to actually redesign our economy so that it's not based on just mining?
Yeah.
But we actually take the money from there as opposed to just making people rich and move it into other sectors, because a lot of the talk so far, yesterday and today, has been about how great design is. However, none of it really talks about how we can actually use it to make money for ourselves.
Yeah, I noticed that yesterday. A little divorced from South African reality, so I thought I'd... listen, I'm really glad to do that. I'll do that as soon as I get back from Washington and explain to them how America has to stop borrowing trillions from China to buy oil from the Middle East, to wage war everywhere, and to there's a real wake-up call in the U.S. In the sense of we're sort of realizing that we've had a lost decade of prosperity based on debt and borrowing, and there's a real need for the U.S. to return to a making culture as opposed to simply a consuming culture. My sense is that the U.S., South Africa, I have to say, being here just only about 2 weeks, has such an incredible wealth of cultural resource here. It has deep, deep culture in terms of visual culture, in terms of fashion, graphics, food, the stuff that is easily packaged and sold on a world market. There's an enormous demand for this kind of thing around the world. It could easily add a huge amount to this kind of design-driven economic growth and entrepreneurialism to South African economy. It's just so rich and so ripe. It very well may be that it's not an argument that one should make with the government, but it's an argument one should make within your own business community. But maybe your government is, more capable than my government. But, hey. So, some more questions, yeah?
Thank you. With respect to what you said about urbanization and transfer of wealth of nations, what are some of your favorite innovations that enable people to, who now have the choice to live densely or not live densely? What are some of the best innovations for making people live comfortably and happily in cities?
Oh, well, I'm a city boy, so I love cities. I think one of the things we're seriously talking about at Parsons is a change in value system from owning to sharing. And I think, and from, stuff to experience and that sort of thing. And I think that plays really well to living in cities. Because if you can, and I think in many ways city people do that. You take, I don't know whether you have a subway system here or trolley system, but all that's about sharing. It's transportation. You don't have to own a car to get from place to place. And I think that concept of sharing facilities, whether they're streets or trolley cars or subways, really lends itself to living in a smaller space and enjoying that space, and also enjoying the ability, once you live in that space, to have all this other space that's open and wilder, if not wild, that you can spend time in. So, and then there is, culture. It has been said that culture is made in cities. And it's certainly true of most cities. And that appreciation of being involved in the creation of culture draws people to cities. I don't think that's an adequate answer to you, but it's the best one I got.
Thanks.
Right now. I think we have time for maybe one more question, is that right? One more really good question.
Can I ask you, in South Africa, the access to information and the internet is really quite a small percentage compared to the US and Europe. What is your thoughts on the use of social media within South Africa, where most people don't have access?
I think social media is turning out to be such a revolutionary mode of change in the world that it's, in terms of policy, it would be a high priority to make that accessible to as many people as possible in South Africa. I'm not quite sure how to do that here. I don't know the intricacies of it. But certainly, in terms of government policy, that would be something that I would try and push for. It's easy for me to say because, in the US we've made a complete mess of it. And we sort of have fallen in a willy-nilly way into broadband without any great policy. So I would argue that, the faster the better, the deeper getting hooked up to the net would be transformative. Okay, thank you very much.
Bruce, thank you very much.
Good.